I hope to be open in January.
Well, welcome and congratulations.
Thank you so much.
Congratulations.
All right, Scott. We have not quite 45 minutes.
You got another one here?
I've notified Siegel that we're running a little late, so this is really important that
It
he
is
gets
really
through
important.
everything, because this is the second time around, so
Yeah.
we'll just let him get through everything.
Just going to be able to Zoom as well.
Yep.
And then we'll get back to you.
For those of you here for the training, please make sure you sign in to get proper credit for your attendance. For those who are watching via Zoom, our IT people will be taking attendance from that. I believe there are also handouts up there. Okay, so please take a handout as you sign in. Thank you.
The megaphone out.
Okay, now you can do the tab back and forth.
Here's that.
Like that?
Yeah, you're going to run it from there?
And I'm going to run it from there. So
Okay.
starting with the video?
Yes.
I think so, yeah.
I got some handouts over on the side. They're reprints of the homework that is on the website. And so we're going to talk about borrowing, what we call debt, and repaying it, what we call debt service, payment of principal interest. Part of the purpose is to lead to eventually the formation of a committee that will make decisions on borrowing for capital improvement projects. It'll form a foundation for them to make decisions. Part of that will be prioritization of projects. Would a public safety project like a fire station take precedence over a community center, for instance? Analyzing the costs to borrow money to finance such a project, and taking into account projects we already have in the works and that we anticipate in the future through the capital improvement plan. So this is a piece of that. You can go ahead and start, Mia, please.
Welcome. This presentation will provide an extensive review of municipal debt and how Massachusetts cities and towns can issue it. Please note that additional requirements may exist for regional school districts and special purpose districts seeking to issue debt. In all cases, please consult with your
Mia, can you
municipal
turn
and
it up?
bond councils when contemplating the issuance of debt. For the Department of Revenue's official guidance on municipal borrowing and debt, see
Thank you.
Informational Guideline Releases 17-21 and 17-22. Municipal debt is debt, ordinarily notes and bonds, issued by cities and towns to lenders in exchange for funds, so that the city or town can fund certain governmental obligations. Debt may be issued to fund the acquisition of capital assets or to undertake a capital project. For example, debt can be used to finance the purchase of fire trucks, school and other municipal facility construction or extraordinary repair of municipal infrastructure, including streets and water and sewer systems, building of parks and playgrounds, and the purchase of land. Cities and towns generally pledge their full faith and credit when borrowing. In some cases, municipalities can pledge a specific revenue stream in order to secure the debt with the lender. Interest on municipal debt is normally tax exempt, providing an incentive for investors. In order to maintain this exemption, the debt must be properly authorized and issued for a governmental purpose. Any change in use of a debt instrument from primarily governmental use to private entity use can result in the loss of tax-exempt status. Debt issuance must be authorized by a 2/3 vote of the local legislative body, which is the city or town council or town meeting. In a city, the mayor may also need to approve of the issuance. In a town meeting form of government, borrowing can be approved contingent upon the approval of a Proposition 2.5 debt exclusion. A vote to do so does not place the exclusion question on the ballot. The decision to present any Proposition 2.5 question to the voters is still made by the Select Board, and authorization is not effective until the exclusion passes. In any vote authorizing a project to be financed by a debt issuance, borrowing should be clearly identified as the funding source, whether it be in the town meeting warrant or the mayor's recommendation to be approved by City Council. Cities and towns may also rescind or reduce a borrowing authorization previously approved by the legislative body. The authorization may be reduced or rescinded only to the extent that no liabilities have been incurred or no third-party rights have vested by issuing debt or executing contracts for the project. Rescission or reduction votes are approved by majority vote of the local legislative body unless otherwise provided by charter, bylaw, ordinance, or otherwise. There are multiple individuals who play a role in the debt issuance process. In terms of municipal staff involved, the local treasurer prepares and issues the bonds or notes, which are typically countersigned by the mayor in a city and by a majority of the select board in a town. Municipalities also hire financial advisors to assist with the debt issuance process. The Public Finance Department of a commercial bank or a non-bank advisor usually provides this service. They provide guidance on which type of debt instrument to use and whether it should be issued through a competitive or negotiated sale. The financial advisor will be able to analyze the debt service impacts of various repayment schedules, determine the costs of purchasing bond insurance, and explain various borrowing restrictions. In addition, they prepare various documents, preliminary and official statements, and bid proposals for the issuance. They will communicate necessary information to credit agencies and work with the community's bond counsel on legal and tax issues. In addition, the community's bond counsel is an attorney or law firm engaged to submit an opinion on whether a borrowing has met all legal prerequisites for debt issuance. In order to do so, bond counsel will draft and review borrowing authorization votes, town meeting warrants and notices, certify the presence of a quorum during any such votes, and ensure that all local charter and bylaw instructions are followed. In the case of a contingent borrowing vote, under Proposition 2.5, the bond counsel can also review the potential ballot question to be linked to the borrowing. Bond counsel will also assist with receiving any state agency approvals necessary for the issuance and provide a legal opinion that confirms the municipality has the authority to issue debt and that an issuance is tax exempt.
Okay, all of that is true. We do employ a financial advisor and bond counsel, attorneys out of Boston, and they look through everything we propose for borrowing and determine if we legally have the authority to do so, how long we can borrow for, whether it qualifies for this or that, or doesn't qualify for this or that. And I dare say I'm certain that every community utilizes the services of an advisor and a bond counsel. They would be foolish not to. Cities and towns don't make up their own procedural rules for issuance of debt. The state does. We have to follow the rules. It should be evident to you now as select board persons that there are a lot of state rules and laws that we have to follow, and this is no different. Please continue, Mia.
A rating agency's function is to render an opinion on the municipality's likelihood of default on debt obligations. Most Massachusetts cities or towns receive bond ratings from Moody's Investors Service, Standard & Poor's, and/or Fitch Ratings. This table shows the different grading systems used by different rating agencies. In addition, the agencies will assign a positive, stable, or negative outlook assessment for each rating. Typically, higher-rated communities garner lower interest rate charges.
Okay, so Orleans is a AAA-rated community. I think most of you know that. It has been since 2014. This is very important. The higher your credit rating, the lower rate of interest you can borrow at. This is probably the primary reason we'd like to try and maintain the rating if we can. If a community starts to get in trouble financially, the rating services will issue what they call a negative credit watch. They'll tell you what they see as the problem, and then when they come back in the year, they want to see some improvement made on it. So it's not something that happens out of the blue overnight. We're a stable credit. We're not on negative credit watch. The most recent rating report is in the homework handouts on the website. Some of the positive notes that they made, that they feel we have consistent, prudent financial management policies and practices, the financial flexibility to absorb additional debt without pressuring budgetary performance, and I'll get into that shortly. Just a moment. And also having a 5-year capital improvement plan in place, and I believe we're going to go to a 15-year, which is probably going to knock their socks off. Yes, Mr. North.
I thought in the spring town meeting, the finance committee suggested that we would get distressed.
Well, I'm going to get into that a little bit, and we can have some discussion of that. we're eventually going to come with a debt policy that will help, I think, explain a lot of this a little better for you. Please continue, Mia.
In conducting an assessment, the rating agency will analyze financial statements, management capability, fiscal stability, economic condition, and other data. The process will often include in-person or telephone interviews with municipal finance officials. On less frequent occasions, a ratings analyst will make a site visit to a city or town to gain a more substantial understanding of its assets and management capabilities. The agency will then issue a report that presents the rating assignment and describes the community's financial position. Purchasers of municipal bonds and notes use this rating when considering their bids. Cities and towns in Massachusetts may only borrow as permitted by the legislature through the general laws or a special act. There are laws in place that govern what municipalities can borrow for and for how long, how they can pay off the debt, and how much debt they are able to authorize and borrow. This table references the statutes that govern specific types of projects municipalities may borrow for. The maximum amount of debt a city or town may have authorized at any time is 5% of its equalized valuation, which is the full and fair cash value of property within the community as biannually determined by the Commissioner of Revenue. However, a number of project types fall outside of the statutory limit. Examples of these types of projects will be reviewed in this presentation. Please also refer to DLS's Asset Useful Life Schedules and Maximum Borrowing Terms Guidelines, which will also be reviewed in this presentation, for additional information.
Okay, this is kind of the point where we left off at the last meeting, talking about equalized valuation. One of the important points to make in the first sentence is the word authorized. They set a limit on total authorized debt, and I'm going to explain that in a moment. And also the last point, some projects do not fall under this statutory limit. We'll discuss those. There are certain types of borrowing that are not used in the equalized valuation. And we'll run through this. This is also in your handouts. So the equalized value is the value of all of the real estate in New Orleans as if you sold it all. And that number is 4.8 billion, is that correct? Yeah, I believe it is. 5% of that is $243 million roughly. They'll say that we cannot exceed that, much like Brad Highnote will tell you there's a levy ceiling and a levy limit. Here we have a debt limit and also a figure below that, which is our borrowing capacity, and I'll show you how we arrive at the figure. The state, when they publish this ratio for each town, only considers long-term debt. They view this as permanent financing. They don't look at short-term financing or conditional financing as part of their equation, and they should, because I believe it gives a truer representation of where the community is. So we have long-term debt of this amount, 47 million. We have short-term bond anticipation note debt that matures in 1 year at about 15 million. We have our state revolving fund sewer construction loan. This is for our sewer project. This is a short-term financing we have obtained through the state, has not yet become what the state would call is permanent financing. Off of this number, Kevin Galligan will tell you, roughly $14 million will come for loan forgiveness from the Cape and Islands Clean Water Trust. But the state's not concerned about that until it becomes permanent financing. They look at it as, okay, you've authorized this. This could potentially become full-time permanent debt for you. And then we have there's that word, authorized unissued debt. An example of this, my friends at the CPC and the Affordable Housing Trust will recognize the $1 million loan at 107 Main Street as debt which has been authorized. We haven't borrowed any of it yet. We haven't issued any of it yet. To borrow it and to issue it are the same term. There are some sewer project appropriations that we've not yet borrowed for that are included in this, but they could someday all become permanent debt. So they have to be considered as a contingent liability, if you will. That gross debt total is here, between all of those items. But what we subtract out of it is debt that is issued outside of the debt limit. We will discuss that. That is what we would call self-supporting debt. Debts that's issued for our water department repairs and maintenance is secured not by the value of the property in Orleans, not by the tax base, but by user charges. So it is debt service that's paid, but the principal amount of it, they don't consider part of the debt limit because taxes do not secure it. This equalized value, loan to value, is based on debt that could impact the tax base. So when they net that out, net debt subject to the debt limit, some $126 million, divided by our $4 billion figure up here, gives us this number, 2.61%. We certainly want to be below the 5% level. Now, on the state Commonwealth of Massachusetts websites, they show this ratio, which we talked about 6 months ago in the spring, only the long-term debt component. Now, the state has all of this other information. Every town has to provide it every single year. They could easily calculate this number for every community so that we could effectively compare ourselves with everyone else, but they don't. We'd have to contact every community, get all of this data, and do it ourselves. Maybe a day will come when they will do this for us. This ratio is commensurate with the town of Chatham, but I have no idea what they have in authorized unissued debt, short-term debt. This number is more commensurate with what the town of Eastham has without considering any of these other items. I have no idea what other items they have there. This number is favorable statewide. This one likely is, but it would take a lot of work to come up with a reasonable comparison there. I would like you to continue at this point,
So
Mia.
before you do that, Mia, to Mr. North's comment, Scott, this illustrates that we are not debt strapped or debt stressed. We're well below the equalized valuation as dictated by the state. And even if we include the things that they don't take into consideration, we are still not debt stressed. So that's important to clarify.
Scott, can I ask too?
Yes.
So on that line, gross authorized unissued debt, you have the data, the ability to tie that back to every single town meeting article, because that's the word authorized. It has to come from a town meeting vote that says, for Mill Pond Landing, we authorize the borrowing of X amount. And not until that goes out to bid and is awarded, does that go from authorized to then issued.
Yes, generally, once authorized, if we are in the planning stages of a project, we typically will borrow it for 1 year
Right.
as a bond anticipation note, so that then it appears here. And once the project is well underway or near completion, we then permanently finance it. So it's almost like a ladder. It goes from authorized to a short-term note to a permanent financing. Yes?
Scott, I love the clarity of this slide in particular, because for most of us as residents, maybe we heard the big number about debt, but not really discriminating between self-supporting debt that the budget takes care of versus debt that taxes are responsible for.
Yes, there's more of that.
That's kind of big.
There's more of that coming.
Yeah, great,
A little
thank you.
further, where we talk about actually paying the principal and interest,
Yeah.
which we're not seeing here
Right,
yet.
great.
Please continue, Mia.
Can you tab it back over?
Oh,
to-
I'm sorry.
A municipality may authorize debt in an amount equal to 10% of its equalized valuation with approval from the Municipal Finance Oversight Board. This table shows the state statutes that govern municipal borrowing limits, purposes, and terms. As stated in the previous slide, local officials should refer to DLS's Asset Useful Life Schedules and Maximum Borrowing Terms Guidelines, an excerpt of which is shown here. The guidelines define the maximum borrowing term for each type of asset or project. The excerpt shown in this slide shows examples of borrowings that apply towards the statutory debt limit, also known as inside debt. This slide shows another excerpt from DLS's Asset Useful Life Schedules and Maximum Borrowing Terms Guidelines. This excerpt shows borrowings that are excluded from the statutory debt limit, also known as outside debt.
Okay.
Before any debt exclusion ballot question is approved by voters,
Stop, please. So that's a lot of information on those two charts. Debt that is considered to be inside of the debt limits, and those that are outside are generally the items such as the water. They have another revenue source that pays it, not the taxes. Those two charts are also in the handouts that were on the website. It tells us how long we can borrow in years for a given project, for instance. Please continue, Mia.
Before any debt exclusion ballot question is approved by voters, local officials should ensure that the requirements of Massachusetts General Law, Chapter 54, which lays out laws and procedures for municipal elections, are fulfilled. For instance, this chapter requires that the municipal clerk receive written notice of the question being placed on the ballot at least 35 days before the date of the election. The requirements of Massachusetts General Law, Chapter 59, Section 21C, which governs procedures specific to Proposition 2.5, should also be fulfilled. Local officials can find more information about Proposition 2.5 ballot question procedures on DLS's website. At the end of the presentation are the website addresses for various DLS publications and its official guidance. Following the election, the city or town clerk must certify the results of the referendum to the Division of Local Services in the Municipal Data Bank. When doing so, the clerk should provide the text of the ballot question, the date of the election, and the vote tally. If the debt exclusion is approved by voters, additional documentation needs to be submitted when the city or town submits its tax rate recap to DLS. A debt exclusion report, called Schedule DE1, must accompany the submission. For borrowing subject to an approved debt exclusion, the annual exclusion amount, or the community share of the project's debt service for that year, is the total principal and interest payment due net of any reimbursement received from the state or federal government for the project. If user fees or other local revenues are being used to fund all or part of the debt service, a community may exclude the principal and interest net of the local revenue, but it is not required to do so. This is the additional taxing authority under Proposition 2.5 available to a community each fiscal year until the debt covered by the exclusion is retired.
Okay. So, different types of debt. General fund debt is debt service, meaning principal and interest is paid for by taxes within the tax levy limit. This impacts the general fund operating budget. We've got self-supporting debt that we talked about, the water projects secured by a dedicated revenue stream, the Community Preservation Act bonding paid by CPA collections. And we have debt exclusions, which were just discussed, paid for by a temporary tax increase voted on by the people in town. They vote to increase their taxes temporarily outside of the tax levy limit. This type of borrowing does not impact the general fund operating budget. It's also known as a Proposition 2.5 debt exclusion or excluded debt. Some other points to make: it can only be used for capital asset or capital project spending. Can't use it to pay the electric bills. We can't use it to pay the police officers. We can't use it to repave the roads if that's not the specific project. It involves a temporary tax increase above Proposition 2.5 limits for the life of the borrowing. And interestingly, there is no limit in any given year on the number of exclusions undertaken or dollar amounts to be borrowed. This is because the taxpayer decides if they want to incur the additional tax liability. They, in essence, are the ones who set the limit. Where borrowing is needed, the Orleans Select Board policy is to fund major capital asset projects by debt exclusion whenever possible, in order to minimize the impact on the general fund operating budget. This then frees up the tax levy for exclusive use in supporting ongoing day-to-day operations. As an example, this is your entire operating budget. Second section in the dark blue is your general fund or tax levy operating budget. If you have general fund debt service and you increase it, you now have a smaller portion of your tax levy to use to pay the electric light bill, to pay the police officers, to pave the roads. And this becomes problematic if your general fund debt service becomes too large. Typically, what we do is with self-supporting debt or debt exclusions, it's outside of the levy. And if we want to, or the residents, vote to increase taxes just for this purpose, the tax bill goes up, the yearly budget of the town goes up, but this has no impact on the operating, general fund operating budget. And I think to answer Mr. North's question, this was a topic in the spring where all debt service costs as a portion of the budget at 20% was listed as number one in the entire state. But what we need to do is exclude the self-supporting debt, as it's not a part of the operating budget, does not impinge upon it. The taxpayer is the one who is eventually going to put the brakes on and say, enough is enough. If 50% of the entire budget was debt exclusion debt, it still would not impact our ability to pay the electric light bill, pay the police officer, or pave the roads. But it is important to have some limits on general fund debt that is not a debt exclusion item, absolutely. The biggest drawback with debt exclusions is the pain at the pump, the taxpayer, and their appetite for taking on additional taxes just to pay a given project. Self-supporting debt works similarly. It's outside of the tax levy, so if we increase, do some water repairs and water mains, and they're secured by charges that are billed from the water company, does not impact the general fund operating budget. So I hope, and this is debt service, principal and interest, and I think that's where we kind of looked at this in the spring, that we were considering all debt service without maybe excluding the debt exclusions or the self-supported.
And Scott, could I jump in on this? Only because the Select Board voted last week on a debt exclusion question for the Nauset Regional High School increased cost. And the point that we tried to make there, and hopefully will continue to educate voters, is there are two ballots. One is a district-wide ballot. If the voters in majority, meaning 50 plus 1%, are in favor of spending the additional money, it behooves our taxpayers to vote the debt exclusion. Otherwise, that allocation comes out of that main operating budget box that you showed.
Yes.
And would not give us the relief that would pay down over time.
That's correct.
the debt.
This is an important concept to learn for all that are involved in debt and borrowing, is how does the debt exclusion work? Very important, because it is easy to confuse and just look at one figure for debt service and apply it to the operating budget, when in fact, that's not an accurate representation. Yes?
So the other major difference, when we have a town meeting and it's a town project, the authorization at town meeting to go forward is contingent on the passage of the debt exclusion question. The Nauset Regional High School project is not contingent on the debt exclusion. So that $1.8 million annual payment without that debt exclusion vote would decimate your operating budget, because you'd be responsible for that, and you don't have the levy capacity to pay for it. So that is the major difference. We always give the voters two opportunities to say yes or no, but the main difference is if that ballot question fails and the article passes, the project does not go forward, there's no additional cost incurred, and we'd have to go back and start the process over. That's a major difference.
So the next video will go into descriptions of short-term and long-term debt. I explained briefly how we use short-term debt, bond anticipation notes, one-year borrowing projects that are in planning stages. They will talk here about tax anticipation notes and revenue anticipation notes. We do not utilize those here since we transitioned to a quarterly tax billing system. We have filled in the gaps, if you will, of revenue coming in. Some communities have to borrow between tax collection dates. That's what those are typically used for. They discuss them, but we do not employ those here. You can roll the tape, Mia, please.
The issuance of short-term debt allows cities and towns to borrow funds on a temporary basis in anticipation of collecting certain revenue sources or issuing approved long-term debt. This type of borrowing allows a community to make interest-only payments until the anticipated revenues or financing source is secured. Short-term issuance typically lasts no longer than 2 years, but can be renewed with a principal payment. Short-term debt can be issued through instruments, which will be detailed in the following slides. Bond anticipation notes, or BANs, are an instrument used to generate cash for initial capital project costs. BANs temporarily finance projects in anticipation of issuing long-term debt, such as a general obligation bond, and are paid off with the proceeds from such an issuance. Once a city or town has voted to authorize debt for a project, it may issue bond anticipation notes in anticipation of issuing the permanent long-term debt. BANs may be issued by the same municipal officers authorized to issue the permanent debt. BANs may be renewed for up to 10 years from the date of issue. However, principal payments are required beginning in the 3rd year until the permanent debt is issued or the loan is paid in full. Each principal payment must be at least equal to the minimum payment that would have been required if the BAN had been converted to long-term debt. BAN proceeds must be spent within certain time frames, shown on the slide, to comply with federal arbitrage rules. As with long-term debt, exceptions to these spending timeframes can be made for small issuers who borrow less than $5 million of tax-exempt debt in a calendar year, or $15 million in the case of school construction. Local officials should consult with their financial advisor and bond counsel to ensure compliance. This table illustrates how BAN paydown procedures work. In this example, the legislative body has voted to authorize $100,000 in borrowing for 20 years to finance a local capital project. Note that the principal payments do not begin until the 3rd year of issuance. After 10 years, $55,552 in principal balance remains. Long-term debt must be issued to finance this amount. Because the original borrowing term was 20 years, the permanent debt must now be issued for a period not to exceed 10 years. A revenue anticipation note, or RAN, is a short-term loan paid off by local revenues, such as tax collections or state aid. RANs, which are issued for a maximum of 1 year, are used to stabilize cash balances until receipt of quarterly or semi-annual tax payments from residents or local aid distributions from the Commonwealth. In a city, these notes may be authorized and issued by the treasurer and typically countersigned by the mayor, unless the city's charter states otherwise. In a town, the treasurer may issue the notes with a majority of the select board countersigning. No vote of a municipality's legislative body is required for RAN issuance. RANs are full faith and credit obligations of a city or town, meaning the city or town agrees to unconditionally guarantee that it will fulfill its debt obligation. The amount borrowed through a RAN issuance cannot exceed the total of the tax levy from the preceding fiscal year, the net amount collected for motor vehicle and trailer excise during the preceding fiscal year, and payments during the preceding fiscal year by the Commonwealth in lieu of taxes for property taken by it for institutions. Cities and towns are able to borrow in anticipation of grants to be received from the federal government or the Commonwealth, or any agency or department of either. Proceeds can be used to fund expenses that will be financed by the grant. In order to borrow in anticipation of a grant, the grant must be for a purpose for which a city or town can borrow for 5 years or more under Massachusetts general law. The grantor of the funds must also have agreed to the grant award. Once received, grant proceeds are used to pay off the loan without any further appropriation. The term of grant anticipation notes cannot exceed 2 years. Massachusetts general law permits for 2 types of grant anticipation notes. Borrowing for grants awarded for highway purposes are governed by Massachusetts general law, Chapter 44, Section 6. Borrowing in anticipation of this type of grant requires a majority vote of the municipality's legislative body. Borrowing for grants awarded for other purposes are governed by Massachusetts general law, Chapter 44, Section 6A. In a city, these notes may be authorized and issued by the treasurer and typically countersigned by the mayor, unless the city's charter states otherwise. In a town, the treasurer may issue the notes with a majority of the select board countersigning. Cities and towns are also able to borrow for the portion of a public works project that will be funded by a federal grant. In order to do so, the local legislative body must approve the project and authorize debt to finance the municipality's share of the project costs. The city or town must also have a signed commitment letter from the federal agency awarding grant and have approval to borrow for this purpose by the Municipal Finance Oversight Board. The maximum issuance for a federal public works grant anticipation note is 2 years. However, the notes may be renewed for as long as the grant commitment is outstanding. Depending on the situation, a city or town may choose to issue either long-term or short-term debt. Long-term debt issuances have maturities greater than 1 year. Once the debt is issued, the municipality makes principal and interest payments to the bondholder based on a fixed schedule. The most common type of long-term debt issued by Massachusetts cities and towns is general obligation debt. Municipalities pledge their full faith and credit to pay off the obligations, which typically mature in anywhere from 5 to 30 years. These bonds are typically competitively marketed nationwide. The Massachusetts Clean Water Trust also provides low-interest loans for up to 30 years to fund local drinking and wastewater projects. Zero-interest loans are also available to fund utility projects in rural areas from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. 10 years is the maximum term of these loans. The USDA also assists rural communities through its Community Facilities Loan Program. Low-interest loans are offered to rural communities to purchase, construct, and improve essential community facilities and equipment, such as healthcare facilities or public works vehicles. The maximum term of these loans is 40 years.
So we don't utilize federal rural development loans or federal community facilities loans, but we have utilized the two on the left, the lower left being the Clean Water Trust revolving fund that we're using for our sewer construction project. The next section talks about qualified bonds. Also something we don't use. Generally what happens is the intercept program where the Commonwealth of Massachusetts grabs the state aid from a community because the community may not be quite so strong enough to make their debt payments, and they utilize it as such. Lawrence, Chelsea, Brockton, Lowell, Fall River, these sorts of communities would generally utilize that. Please roll the tape, Mia.
The Commonwealth's Qualified Bond Program allows municipalities to issue general obligation bonds payable from its local aid distributions. Bonds issued through the program benefit from the strength of the state's credit rating since the payment source is state aid. This, in turn, results in lower interest rates on debt issuances than what might otherwise be possible if the debt were paid locally. The Division of Local Services works with the State Treasurer's Office, who administers the program and ensures local aid distributions are intercepted to fund the repayment of interest and principal on the outstanding bonds. Each city, town, or regional school district must receive authorization to issue state qualified bonds by the Municipal Finance Oversight Board, which is chaired by the state auditor. When reviewing applications, the Municipal Finance Oversight Board ensures that the bonds are being issued for an allowable purpose, such as a capital project or final judgment payment. The board will also analyze whether the municipality's local aid amounts will be enough to pay down the amount borrowed. Bond proceeds must be spent within certain timeframes, shown on this slide, to comply with federal arbitrage rules. Exceptions to these spending timeframes can be made for small issuers who borrow less than $5 million of tax-exempt debt in a calendar year, or $15 million in the case of school construction. Local officials should consult with their financial advisor and bond counsel to ensure compliance.
So in essence, when you borrow money, you have to spend it within a certain amount of time. There was a chart similar to this for short-term borrowing, and it also applies for long-term. Another consideration that you don't borrow today and sit on the money for 5 or 6 years till you spend it. That's part of the debt management process. Please continue, Mia.
Principal payments on long-term debt are made in annual amounts. The first debt service payment takes place no later than the end of the fiscal year that begins after the date of issue. There are two primary repayment structures used to pay off debt obligations. The first is level debt service structure, in which the combined annual amount of principal and interest payments remains relatively constant over the life of the bond. The second payment structure is called level principal, in which only the amount of principal payments remains relatively constant over the life of the bonds. This results in debt service payments that are initially higher but decline over time.
Okay, this is important. They talked about two debt repayment schedules. Level debt is much like your home mortgage, your car loan, your installment loans. It's the type that we're all familiar with. You pay the same amount every month. You may notice that early years of those repayments you pay a lot in interest and not much principal. And toward the end of those loans you pay a lot in principal, not much interest. In the municipal realm, they have something else known as declining debt, where the yearly debt service payments decline over time. This would be suitable for a depreciable asset, a fire truck, for instance, where you want your debt payments to eventually decline as the value of the asset does. This is a more aggressive form of debt repayment. It allows faster pay down of debt and lower total interest paid over the life of the loan. It does involve higher payments in the first several years and lower ones in the later years, and depending on what you're financing, what the asset is. We may choose one or the other. Interest rates, I think they spoke about these. They're determined at the time the borrowing occurs. They remain fixed for the life of the loan period. Refinancing opportunities, they'll talk about shortly. Bonds cannot, and people ask this, can we prepay? Bonds cannot be refinanced or prepaid until a 10-year time period has elapsed. It's not an Orleans rule, it's not a Massachusetts rule, it's a nationwide. It's been around for years and years and years. Any bond with a maturity date of less than 10 years don't qualify for refinancing. They just run out to their maturity date. So another reason we have to be careful not to issue a bond too prematurely if a project isn't complete or isn't going to be complete. You have to be aware. Let's see, the next one I want to talk about, as they did paying down the debt, I'm going to just use a small example. We look at a capital improvement plan and we see in year 1, 2, 3, 4, we see this cost being incurred, and another cost, and another cost.
You didn't flip to the slide.
I did now.
There you go.
So here's just an example. These are real Orleans numbers. If you were sitting at the town meeting in FY18, we had 49 million in debt. And you looked at the capital improvement plan and you saw another 4 million being issued a year later. Another 5.5 million 2 years after that. Another 11.5 million in FY22. So you see another 21 million in debt going on the books, added to the 49 million that you know we're on the hook for as you're sitting in that town meeting and you're saying, geez, in 4 years we're going to have $70 million in debt outstanding. But what the capital improvement plan doesn't show you, and what is an important piece, is the pay down of the debt over time. So that after taking on $21 million in new debt, we actually have less outstanding than we did 5 years earlier. This tells me that if we took on 21 million here, we paid down 23. So part of the planning process, and this is often forgotten piece of it, is how the debt gets retired over time. A debt service schedule like this will show principal and interest each year. This is also in the handout, $6.5 million this year, and then declining as each year goes on. 6 years from now, we'll have roughly half outstanding as we do now, and this will be part of this committee's task to look at what is known as debt roll-off or debt drop-off. As debt is repaid, that increases our capacity and our ability to take more on, and I think this kind of graphically shows that's what occurred here over this 5-year period. Again, the goal in mind is to try to keep this relatively stable, and that leads to a stable tax rate as well. Now we're going to be in a different level once the sewer debt comes on board, but when it does at a higher figure, we'll try to also moderate that sort of a thing going forward. Let's see, Mia, you can roll the tape, please.
Local officials can project different payment structure scenarios using the debt service calculator available on DLS's website. Both level debt service and level principal structures can be compared. The financial management team should consult their financial advisor to make the ultimate decision on which structure to use. Refunding a bond is like refinancing a mortgage to take advantage of lower interest rates. New debt is issued in the form of refunding bonds, and the proceeds are used to retire the outstanding debt. The City Council or Select Board may authorize refunding bonds or notes for the purpose of paying or refunding all or part of a previous bond or note issuance. In most cases, a refunding can only take place if it results in debt service savings. There are exceptions made when a refunding is needed to correct the tax-exempt status of the outstanding debt. The term of the refund borrowing must be within the original term authorized for the bonds or notes to be refunded.
Okay, my friends in the CPC, did you see that bond calculator? Now we can plug numbers in there and figure out where we're going to be going forward in the future. I knew you were going to like that. Okay, so how are we doing time-wise?
You just go along, don't
Okay.
worry about the time.
Okay.
But the refinancing, so we have done
Refinancing, all right,
refunding.
that was a good point. So we have refinanced debt. We've refinanced higher interest debt in 2012. We refinanced higher interest debt in 2015, and most recently refinanced higher interest rate debt in 2021, and I believe our interest savings were 800 and some odd thousand with the most recent one. Whenever we can do so, we will. In terms of net interest costs, we have no long-term debt outstanding that exceeds a 3% interest cost to the town at this time, which personally I think is impressive. We've done all that we can. I dare say if we came to market tomorrow, however, we would be above that rate because the interest rate environment is not attractive now. We are not bonding any projects in this cycle, so hopefully things will be better 12 months from now. We'll see. I want to now talk about,
We will be issuing bans. Our renewal for our ban is up, so we will be coming to the Select Board in January with our new temporary ban sale to refinance that $15 million plus any additional cash flow we need for new projects that have been approved. But we were not inclined at this stage to go out to the bond market because of the interest rate environment at this point, so we'll wait and see what happens next year.
yes, that's
Thank you.
correct. So one thing they don't really talk about at all in this video is bond premium. We've all heard this when it comes up and when we approve a borrowing, and I'm going to go through a quick example here. Let's say the going rate of interest on a one-year note is 1.5%. That's the market rate of interest. And we need to borrow $10,638,000. And these are actual Orleans numbers from a borrowing a few years ago. So let's say one of you has this sum of money to invest. Let's say Andrea Reed has $10.6 million. She wants to invest. So the way a bond premium is generated is the town of Orleans says, well, rather than pay 1.5%, which you can get anywhere from any town, we'll pay you 2.5%. Who wouldn't do that? Andrea's on board with it, but then all of a sudden in comes Mr. Matheson and he says, well, I'll tell you what, in order for me to get that higher 2.5% interest rate, I'll give you another $25,000 on top of that $10 million. And in comes Meth and he says, well, I'll give you $50,000 on top of that because I got the $10 million to invest in order to get that higher 2.5% interest rate. And then Michael comes in, I'll go up to $75,000 to get that higher 2.5% interest rate. And finally, Kevin comes in and blows him out of the water and he says,
No.
I'll pay $108,000 in addition to that $10.5 million to get that higher interest rate. So what happens is we will pay Kevin 2.5% interest, this figure, on the $10 million sum. And at maturity, he doesn't get the premium back. We keep it. He only gets the $10,600,000 back. We take the premium and deduct it from our interest cost so that our net interest cost, or as the treasurers call it, the NIC, is 1.47%. That's Kevin's true rate of return, 1.47%. So this is how we generate a bond premium, by fixing or forcing a higher interest rate in the marketplace and getting people to pay up more. In reality, they end up the same as they would have if we just sold it at face value. From the bond premium, we are allowed to deduct issuance costs. Prior to 2017, we had to budget for them. The municipalities don't have to anymore. It comes out of here now. So this is how, in a nutshell, how a premium is generated. Not often understood, in my opinion. I hope it's somewhat clear. But the net interest after Kevin's going to make this, he's going to lose that. This is his net interest return divided by his principal equals the net interest cost. And the state also tells us what we can do with bond premiums other than issuance costs. In some circumstances, we can apply them to the outstanding principal of projects. Mia rolled the tape. They'll go into that now.
How premiums are accounted for depends upon when the note or bond was sold, before or after November 7, 2016. First, let's review accounting for premiums on notes or bonds sold before 11/7/2016. These premiums on bonds or notes sold before 11/7/16 belong to the general fund. If a debt exclusion was approved for the borrowing, the premium must be reserved for appropriation to offset interest paid in future years, and the amount excluded each year is reduced by premium adjustment, or appropriated to pay project costs and reduce the amount of the borrowing. Second, here is the accounting treatment for premiums on notes or bonds sold after 11/7/2016. These premiums, net of issuance costs, received as a result of the issuance of bonds or notes, are not treated as general fund revenue. The net premium must either be 1. Used to pay project costs and to reduce the amount of the borrowing authorization by the same amount when the borrowing vote so authorizes, or 2. Reserved for appropriation for capital projects for which a loan has been or may be authorized for an equal or longer period of time than the loan for which the premiums were received. If voters approved a Proposition 2.5 debt exclusion for the particular borrowing under General Law, Chapter 59, Section 21CK, the amount excluded must be adjusted to reflect the true interest cost of the borrowing. General Law, Chapter 44, Section 20. Therefore, premiums received for debt excluded borrowings should be applied to pay project costs and reduce the amount of the borrowing. If not, the premium must be reserved for appropriation for other capital projects, as previously stated, but in this case, there will be an annual reduction to the amount of the exclusion. For more information on the treatment of premiums, including for excluded debt, please review guidance available on the Division of Local Services website. The location of this guidance will be at the end of this presentation. The amount of the surplus is determined at the time the purpose, project, or acquisition is completed, regardless of when the loan was authorized, the bonds or notes were sold, or purpose completed. The amount of surplus proceeds is the difference between the amount borrowed and the amount actually spent to complete each purpose for which the city, town, or district has authorized debt. Selling bonds or notes for multiple authorized purposes at the same time does not alter the purpose, term, or amount of each loan. If the amount of bond proceeds remaining after a project is completed is $50,000 or less, the surplus proceeds may be applied to the payment of debt service with the approval of the Chief Executive Officer. A city, town, or district may abandon or discontinue a borrowing purpose, project, or acquisition if no liability remains outstanding and unpaid by a 2/3 vote of all the members of the City Council or a 2/3 vote of the voters present and voting at an annual town or district meeting. The proceeds remaining after a borrowing purpose, project, or acquisition is abandoned or discontinued may be appropriated for any purpose for which a loan may be authorized for an equal or longer period of time than that for which the original loan, including temporary debt, was issued. Where the project is abandoned or discontinued, there is no option for the Chief Executive Officer to approve the application of the remaining proceeds of $50,000 or less to the payment of debt service. However, the amount of the debt exclusion for the project must be reduced when the debt excluded proceeds are appropriated for a project that is not also debt excluded. Surplus loan proceeds in any amount remaining after the project is completed may be appropriated for any purpose for which the municipality may borrow for an equal or greater term than the term for which that loan was issued. When there is a surplus of $50,000 or less, however, the municipality may apply the surplus to the payment of any debt service with the approval of the Chief Executive Officer. However, surplus proceeds remaining after the completion of a project financed with restricted funds, such as an enterprise fund or community preservation fund, remain subject to the relevant restrictions of the fund. The amount of the debt exclusion for the project must be reduced when the debt excluded proceeds are appropriated for a project that is not also debt excluded. Please refer to IGR 2017-21 and 2017-22 for more information.
And those documents are in the homework area once again. We have about 3 minutes left. The next section is on emergency spending. The town has done this type of deficit spending for FEMA and snow emergency related costs, but we have not undertaken emergency borrowing as described in the video. Please continue, Mia.
Massachusetts general law allows cities and towns to deficit spend to address emergency needs in the wake of major disasters, including but not limited to flood, drought, fire, hurricane, earthquake, storm, or other catastrophe that poses an immediate threat to the health or safety of a community. Emergency deficit spending can be funded either by appropriation, the following year's tax revenues, or through emergency borrowing. In order for emergency spending to begin, an emergency declaration must be approved by the governor or a majority of a select board in a town or 2/3 of a city or town council. In addition, the Division of Local Services Director of Accounts must provide approval. Eligible expenses include employee overtime, debris removal, contractual assistance, and emergency repairs for public buildings and infrastructure. Emergency expenditures may be funded through borrowing on a short-term basis or for a longer term. When borrowing on an emergency basis, cities and towns typically can issue debt to fund the emergency expenditures with a maximum maturity of 2 years. The debt may be authorized by the treasurer with the approval of the municipality's chief executive officer, typically the select board in a town or mayor in a city. The Division of Local Services Director of Accounts must approve of any emergency debt issuance. A city or town seeking to borrow on an emergency basis for a term longer than 2 years must do so with the approval of the director. The director may approve for borrowing terms up to 10 years. Municipalities may not borrow for the funding of collective bargaining agreements or items previously disapproved by the legislative body for the fiscal year in which the borrowing is sought. Municipalities may also borrow for longer periods to fund emergency capital expenditures authorized by treasurer with approval of the chief executive officer of the city or town. In this case, borrowing to fund these expenditures must also be approved by the Municipal Finance Oversight Board, or MFOB, the term of which may not exceed the term for the borrowing purpose. In order to receive approval, the city or town must demonstrate that the regular debt authorization process poses undue hardship in meeting emergency needs. Division of Local Services plays a role in the oversight of municipal borrowing. The division is also represented on the Municipal Finance Oversight Board, or MFOB, and approves notes issued through the State House Notes Program. Additional information about the MFOB and the State House Notes Program is available on DLS's website. DLS's Director of Accounts also sets the maximum borrowing terms and useful life of assets for some issuance purposes. The borrowing purpose table, which sets forth these terms, can also be found on DLS's website. The Division of Local Services also works with the Office of the State Treasurer and Receiver General to ensure cities and towns do not default on debt service obligations. If a municipality is able to certify to the division that it will be unable to make a debt payment, and the division agrees, the state treasurer is notified. The payments are then paid directly by the treasurer out of local aid payments to be made to the community from the Commonwealth. For more information on specific programs mentioned in this presentation, please visit these links for the United States Department of Agriculture, Massachusetts School Building Authority, Massachusetts Clean Water Trust, and the State House Notes Program. For the Department of Revenue's official guidance on borrowing, please see IGR 2017-21 and IGR 2017-22. For more information on Proposition 2.5, please see the DLS publication, Proposition 2.5 Ballot Questions, Requirements and Procedures, August 2017.
Okay, so in the event that you wake up in the middle of the night and a question hits you, you can email them in. We'll be glad to answer them. We could go on another hour with some other important points, but I think we hit what we need as a good foundation to begin with. To receive, I was going to read that.
Yeah, can you?
With that slide back on, Mia? Thank you.
Is that you?
To receive credit for watching the training in its entirety, please send an email to Select Board's office at mbates@town.orleans.ma.us. In the subject line of the email, include the phrase valuation.
Your name under it? On the slide? Didn't look like you, unless that's 10 years
Yeah.
from now.
Yeah, that's strange. Who is that in the video? Oh, is that Kathleen? Oh, that's, okay.
That's the
Yes,
OPEB woman.
that's OPEB. Yeah.
We
that's
just need a
not me.
transition.
Scott, do we want to end, or do we want to ask questions?
No, this is huge, Scott. I'm so grateful that you took the time to do this. Do you have some quick questions? Because we are,
Scott, I just wanted to ask, we had that self-supporting debt category, which water department borrowings and CPC borrowings fall into. How do we recognize, or at least account for our wastewater borrowings where we've sequestered a repayment source that's other than taxpayer dollars, like the short-term rental tax collections, which is going to pay some percentage of that cost, but not all of it. But still, it is a
Like a self-supporting.
Right.
Yeah, good
Right.
question. We'll see. I don't have the answer for you. But it should behave like that. Yeah, it's not a dedicated revenue stream from water charges. I don't know how the state views it, how they would qualify it, if it's something inside our debt limit or outside of it. I'm not certain.
This was huge.
So the questions going, if anybody has any questions, because the time is limited, please email them to either Molly Bates or to Scott Walker at swalker@town.orleans.ma.us. And we'll, based on the type and the number of questions, we will summarize as best we can and put a posting on the website with that Q&A. Also, this presentation the workshop will be on the website by the end of the week for viewing by those required participants, and just follow the instructions to make sure that you get proper credit for attending the training session.
There was some pushback about, what do you mean required? And I think it's fair to say that if you have put in the time to take the training and you're interested in continuing to serve on a board or committee that has financial implications, without the training, I would say you are a less strong candidate for either reappointment or an initial appointment. So although we're all volunteers, but if you're serious about your service in this town, we do expect you to speak the language. So just wanted to clarify that. We mean business.
Thank you, Scott.
Yeah, thank you. The fluency with which we can speak about these things and make educated decisions is huge. You're opening a world of participation to some of us that we have not had access to before. So thank you. And I dare say if the questions or you feel there's more, we'll schedule another follow-up in January or February as the budgeting process and the long-term financial planning group gets convened. So that's great. Thank you very, very much. I know you guys put a lot of time into this. And I'm also mindful that we have